Ryan McNeill from over at Reuters, he's been thinking about bats for 3 years. Specifically, he's been thinking about bats and pandemics.
On the NewsHour tonight, the coronavirus conundrum.
Back in 2020, like everyone else, Ryan was following news coverage about the origins of COVID-19. Speculation that bats were the source of the virus.
She is very confident, about 90% confident, and her colleagues are as well, that this came from bats, that there was a transmission from bats to humans that took place at a...
But when Ryan heard all this, he thought the explanations he was getting, they generated more questions than answers.
There was news coverage about the role of bats and the role of habitat disruption, at the time. But from my perspective, it always sort of lacked specificity about, well, where exactly is it happening and who is responsible for it happening?
Ryan couldn't let these questions go. So he started learning everything he could about viruses and about bats, too.
One of the things that's amazing about bats is, they have this enormous diversity. There's a ton of different bat species. Bats make up something like a quarter of all the mammalian species on Earth.
Whoa. Really?
Yes.
All these different bat species, Ryan learned. They were like flying petri dishes for disease. Viruses could incubate inside them and wait for a chance to hop to humans. And over the last 2 decades, us humans, we've been moving closer and closer to what Ryan calls the Batlands. He knows this because he's been mapping out these regions, mapping places that might end up as the cradle of the next pandemic.
These high-risk areas that we identified, 1.8 billion people live in those areas. It's about 1 in 5, depending on who's counting, of every man, woman, and child on Earth. It's not the bats that are at fault. It is us encroaching where they are and where they've been since, forever.
I feel like you've become a bat nerd.
You don't really have a choice when you spend this long on something.
Did what you found over the last 3 years reassure you about the next pandemic?
No, not at all. I came away thinking we are doing an enormous amount of damage, and that damage is increasing.
Today on the show, can understanding the Batlands help prevent the next outbreak? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This podcast is brought to you by TD Ameritrade. Traders come in all shapes, sizes, and experience levels. It's a good thing TD Ameritrade's award-winning customer service is much more reliable and flexible than ever, with specialized teams available to help with all trading questions from all types of traders. Learn more at tdameritrade.com/customer service. TD Ameritrade, where smart investors get smarter. Rated #1 customer service 2022 by stockbrokers.com. Macy's is committed to supporting college access and better student outcomes. Throughout May, join Macy's in celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month by supporting APIA Scholars, whose mission is to equip AAPI young adults with the resources they need to succeed in higher education and beyond. Just round up your next in-store purchase or donate online to APIA Scholars. Shop AAPI-owned products and learn more at macys.com/purpose. Let's start by defining a term that I think is really important: zoonotic spillover. What is it and why is it important?
This is the term that scientists use to describe when a virus circulating among wildlife infects a human. And as far as bats go, of course, there are lots of animals that are reservoirs for disease. But as far as bats go, They've been linked to some, that we've all heard of. SARS too, of course.
COVID.
Yeah. COVID, Ebola, the original SARS, Marburg, Nipah, Hendra.
This is like a greatest hits of infectious disease.
Yeah, you could say that.
A special thing about bats is that they can often harbor these diseases but stay healthy themselves. Scientists aren't exactly sure why. It could be that bats are too warm-blooded for these germs to thrive. In any case, Ryan says, one of the key things to know about zoonotic spillover is that it isn't just about chance encounters between humans and bats. Supercharged economic development rapidly accelerates the way novel infections spread.
And if you look at our first story, which takes place in West Africa, we visit a mine in the Nimba Mountains in Liberia that is owned by ArcelorMittal, a Luxembourg-based mining giant. And testing of bats there as mining expansion was occurring found links to Ebola in bats that lived sort of around the mining concession.
That's not a great advertisement for working in that mine.
Well, the mine is expanding. They are Liberia's #1 taxpayer. And recently, as that mine has expanded, the population has grown. I believe our number was an 80% increase, according to ArcelorMittal's own documents. And that's an 80% increase just over a decade. And, that's a common thing that happens with mines across West Africa. Is not only are you going into remote areas, right? And you're taking workers into those areas, but then you also draw people who are looking for work.
So it snowballs.
It can, yes.
Just across the border from this mine, in 2013, bats triggered an Ebola outbreak. It ended up killing thousands. The mine says it's mitigating its risk as best it can. Nevertheless, it's in what Ryan's team dubbed a jump zone. That's a place where humans and animals, especially bats, are interacting in new and potentially dangerous ways.
These jump zones have expanded by 16% during the last 2 decades. And they've expanded in some places such as India, which are very heavily populated. So you take India now has, by our estimates, 500 million people at risk that live within these areas. Now, conversely, you could look at somewhere like the Amazon, where, we have an enormous rainforest that is incredibly biodiverse and being chewed up in enormous numbers, but you still don't quite have that population that you do, say, in West Africa or India or Southeast Asia. But when you build roads into forests and you start building towns, eventually growth follows.
I want to look a little deeper at how bat-to-human zoonotic spillover works. And I wonder if we could focus in on one outbreak from a few years back, May of 2018, in India. That's where a man named Mohammed Sabith got a fever. Can you tell me what happened?
Yeah, he lived in Kerala, which is in the southwest part of India. In 2018, he wakes up with a fever. He's staying with his parents. So he goes to a community hospital. But over the next 24 hours, his symptoms worsen. He is vomiting, has delirium, tremors, violent coughing. And doctors treated him with antibiotics and antivirals, and his lungs filled with fluid. His oxygen levels plunged, and he was dead 2 days after he became ill. And this was remarkable because it turned out to be Nipah, which is the first known appearance of Nipah in Kerala, in this part of India.
I've heard a little bit about the Nipah virus, but can you just explain what it is, like how it impacts you and how dangerous it is?
So they know it comes from bats. It infects people when their eyes, nose, or mouth come into contact of fluids containing the virus, such as saliva, urine, blood, nasal or respiratory droplets. A really good example would be Bangladesh, where Nipah infections, these Nipah spillovers, have become really quite common every year. And the reason scientists have discovered is largely driven by date palm sap. It is considered a delicacy in parts of Bangladesh. The tree is tapped and the sap runs into these big canisters, and bats happen to love it for the same reason that Bangladeshis do.
It's nice and sweet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they gorge on this. And
they end up peeing in the syrup.
That's right. And so this emergence in 2018 in India was a long way from Bangladesh. And it was a long way from Malaysia, where Nipah was first found. So
it was a kind of a mystery? Like, how did Nipah get here?
Yes. So Kerala is still a mystery, and it struck 2 more times since then, in 2019 and 2021.
Well, you did find that this man, Mohammed, and people he knew, they were picking up fruit from the ground, right? That the bats had taken a bite out of?
Yes. And, the scientists tested fruit and other things around the area, and they didn't find Nipah.
Huh.
So that's part of the mystery is now the rain may have washed it away. Finding the exact point of spillover can sometimes be very difficult, because by the time the scientists arrive, the trail's gone cold.
Yeah. Your team did do something interesting to understand Mohammed's case. You looked at satellite imagery. Can you explain why you did that and what you found?
Satellite imagery was key to this entire investigation. So in the case of this 2018 outbreak, you can look at the satellite images over time, and you can see the houses popping up in this area that was once, much less densely populated. And one of the other interesting things that our model picked up on was a spike in risk right before Mohammed was infected.
You mean, like, looking back at the data, you could have shown, like, oh, there's a higher risk of transmission at this point. Why was that?
Well, so when I went digging into why the model made that prediction for this particular area, it was because it had picked up on tree cover loss in the area. And so I went and I looked at the satellite imagery, and there were a couple of little chunks of trees that had gone missing. It's impossible, again, to know exactly what role, if any, that might have played in this particular incident. But it does point to, that there was habitat disruption going on in this area leading up to when Mohammed was infected.
Given that you found that, I wonder if scientists have started coming to you and saying, can we use this tool proactively to figure out where we need to manage risk better?
Well, certainly what we hope is that this is a public service of sorts. One scientist named Barbara Hahn, who specializes in, she's a disease ecologist at the Carey Institute in New York, and she's specializes in using machine learning to sort of predict the emergence of zoonotic diseases like this. She said, what this shows, what you're doing here is it shows how risk is clumped. It's not evenly distributed across the earth. There are certain places where the risk is clumped. And we can point to those places and say, perhaps we should focus there. Perhaps we should focus our prevention efforts, our surveillance, our science, our funding, et cetera, et cetera. We can focus it at those places right there.
Yeah. The beauty of what you've done, which is mapping out these jump zones, is that you can see where future outbreaks could happen. Can you just tick off what the hotspots are to you, looking at the next decade or so?
I think one that we should pay close attention to is Southeast Asia and Laos in particular, because we visited a cave in a place called Phuong District, this once kind of remote area in Laos, where workers were harvesting bat guano in these big caves. They take it, they shovel it.
Yeah, you took photos, and there are all of these. There are just tons of bags, and people are doing this work barefoot.
Yes, and they have cuts, burns, lesions from exposure to the ammonia that's present because of the bat waste in these caves. But this place where they're working is where scientists from the Pasteur Institute recently found bats with coronaviruses that are the sort of closest match to SARS-CoV-2. It's the closest match that anyone has found in the wild. And so you have, these workers in these caves doing this work. And one of the workers told us that they went to build a tourist site that lures tourists to come and see these bats, every night, kind of like you've seen in Austin, Texas, where everybody goes and sits by the bridge to watch the bats come out. So this is a really good example, right, of a remote area that was once fairly disconnected that is now being connected to both, there's a new high-speed rail line that goes very close to this area, as well as a brand new expressway, the first one in Laos. Both of these are financed and built by the Chinese to speed goods that are being made in Laos to take it to China. And it also means people are moving on these trains.
I think what you're talking about here is so important because, and I just want to focus in on it for 1 second, because the work that these people have been doing in this cave in Laos has been happening a very long time, is my understanding. Is that right?
Sure.
But what's new is all of the development, the high-speed rail, the highways, the interest in tourism and luring people to these areas. And it's this kind of, if you build it, they will come thing, where these remote regions with some risk, that risk might have been able to be mitigated before simply because they were remote. And that's just not the case anymore.
That's right. And if you look, my colleague, Grant Smith, did a pretty interesting analysis to simulate what would happen if a virus emerged in this town in the Amazon called Altamira. And, because of the air travel connections in Brazil and then Brazil around the rest of the world, it was able to infect, according to this model, this novel virus, could infect, I believe the number is 1.2 billion, which dwarfs the spread of COVID-19 within 6 months. So yes, we are interconnected in a way that we never were before. And with that comes new risks.
We'll be back after a break.
Smoothie King asks, what's that sound? That's the sound of hearts popping out of your eyes when you see Smoothie King's all-new smoothie bowls. These Power Pack beauties are just waiting to be spooned. Our smoothie bowls start with acai or pitaya and are handcrafted with fresh toppings like sliced bananas, sweet berries, ripe mangoes, crunchy Purely Elizabeth granola, and a savory peanut butter drizzle. That's the sound of a smoothie bowl being made fresh, just for you. The new Smoothie Bowls menu, only at Smoothie King.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Lithwick, legal correspondent, author, and host of Slate's Amicus podcast. It's a show about the rule of law, the law, and the Supreme Court justices who interpret it for the rest of us. I wanted to give you a heads up about an exciting upcoming live event that we're doing on Wednesday, May 24th. Mark Joseph Stern and I will be live in D.C. to talk about the end of the court term and how we should be covering it as journalists. We are putting together an amazing roster of special guests, and for those who'd like to go all out on the event, there's going to be a happy hour before where you can meet me and Mark and some of our colleagues from Slate. Get more information at slate.com/live. Would love to see you there. And Slate Plus members, you'll get a special discount on tickets. You can find member event discount codes by signing into Slate and visiting your account. I'm Dahlia Lithwick, host of Amicus, Slate's podcast about the courts and the law.
Trump's entire defense was based not only on E. Jean being a liar, but pretty much on every other person who testified in that courtroom also being a liar.
This week, history-making lawyer Robbie Kaplan and the only woman ever to hold Donald J. Trump to account in a court of law, E. Jean Carroll, join me on the show.
I didn't think there would be a grade above what I was experiencing with Robbie as we gripped hands in the courtroom.
We go deep on their groundbreaking case, their victory, how it all came together, how they plan to respond to the former president's evident desire to keep paying defamation damages forever into the future.
Robbie has figured it out.
Oh, good.
Robbie has figured
That's
it
nice
out.
to know. Tell me what I figured out.
You figured out legal recourse to Donald Trump's lies.
Amicus with me, Dahlia Lithwick, every Saturday through June. That's AMICUS. Find us wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Ryan's team has identified a few solutions when it comes to stopping zoonotic spillover. But naming the answers is a lot easier than putting them into practice. Ryan actually compared the scope of the problem here and its intractability to climate change.
There are a few things that sort of need to happen to help mitigate risks. One of those is governments have to identify and acknowledge the risks associated with, these bat-rich areas. But then we're also talking about, more money. The World Bank and others have estimated $10 billion a year is needed to help developing countries cut risk and respond to outbreaks. Some might say that's a lot of money, but I guess the counter would be, how much did COVID-19 cost people around the world? Governments must mandate health risk assessments before approving projects that disrupt bat habitats. And so you're talking about a couple of things, right? You're talking about this battle between the global economy and, this risk to humanity. And there's some similarities to that with climate change.
Yeah, because, what you're saying is the larger countries, the richer countries, may not want the risk of a pandemic, but that also means telling smaller countries, poorer countries, stop economically expanding in this way. Stop exploiting your resources. Stop expanding into these regions where you're going to come up against these bat populations, or just, kind of destroy these natural habitats. And that's a complicated thing to do.
Yeah, say you're Liberia. And, this ArcelorMittal mine that I mentioned, they are Liberia's largest taxpayer. So if you're the government of a country like Liberia, you've got choices to make.
Yeah. I found the comparison between pandemic preparedness and climate change response alarming for a couple of reasons. Like, the first reason was that I think a lot of people would say, we haven't been responding especially well to climate change. So it doesn't really engender a lot of hope to make the comparison here. But I guess the other thing that stands out to me is that with climate change, while you can argue that the global community isn't doing what it needs to do to meet the moment, there is at least a large-scale mobilization happening. You see massive multinational agreements and conferences. People are talking about it all the time. I don't see anything like that for pandemic prevention.
Well, the World Health Organization is hosting international negotiations toward a pandemic treaty that would be legally binding in all the nations that sign up. The organizations involved in these talks are pushing for the treaty to acknowledge this One Health concept, which is the idea that, that we should treat wildlife health and human health as two sides of the same coin. So, there are talks. It's not for me to opine where those are going to go, but they do exist.
I guess we just don't know. We don't know where they're going to land right now, because reading your reporting, it's impossible to miss the fact that this viral spread is being driven by huge economic changes in vulnerable places. And your reporting team gives these examples of public health authorities, locally, doing things like broadcasting warnings to people in remote places who live near bats, urging them not to eat potentially contaminated food. And it just seems like putting all this pressure on the most vulnerable in this situation to help themselves, rather than addressing the fact that, okay, there's a giant mine here and maybe there's going to be another mine down the street in a little bit,
It takes a lot of things for a spillover to happen. There are lots of risk factors. And so maybe it's one of those things where it's about addressing as many possible things as you can. Maybe it's about don't eat the fruit that has bite marks on it. Maybe it's don't drink date palm sap. It's also about, the international community funding surveillance and research and scientists to go into these areas and do the work that they need to do. It's also an international treaty that requires impact assessments, biological impact assessments. So maybe it's about multiple layers of protection, taking action in multiple ways, because these viruses can find different pathways. It just needs the right one.
Your story is obviously not a happy one necessarily. Like there's a lot of challenges your team has revealed. But I also do kind of feel like there's something sweet underlying the reporting, which is this connection that we have with the natural world around us, including bats. Like, I think some people could read the headline of your story or like a few paragraphs and be like, ugh, like these bats are dirty, like get them away from me. But I wonder if after all this reporting years, you kind of see it differently.
Well, bats are so important to our existence. They're pollinators. They're so important to the ecosystems. And, you know, what we do to them and their world, and that's the same goes for lots of other animals as well, can affect our own health.
So do unto others as you'd want them to do unto you.
Perhaps that's the way to put it.
Ryan, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Ryan McNeill is the London-based deputy editor for the Reuters Global Data Journalism team. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go find me on Twitter. I'm at Mary's Desk. Thanks for listening. Talk to you tomorrow. Macy's is committed to supporting college access and better student outcomes. Throughout May, join Macy's in celebrating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month by supporting APIA Scholars, whose mission is to equip AAPI young adults with the resources they need to succeed in higher education and beyond. Just round up your next in-store purchase or donate online to APIA Scholars. Shop AAPI-owned products and learn more at Macys.com/purpose.